Hello, I think we can start. Welcome back to a new episode of Europe Responds, the EU ISS series that looks at the issues at Europe's strategic horizon and their implications and relevance for the EU and its member states. I'm Giuseppe Spatafora, I'm the host of this series, and I'm connecting from Washington, D.C. today. So good morning from here. And I'm joined by my good colleague, Joris Teer, who's the research analyst on economic security and technology at the UISS. Good morning, Joris.
Good morning, Giuseppe.
And the title of today's episodes is Will the US-China rare earth ceasefire hold, and what are the implications for Europe? It's a very timely topic, and I'm going to give a short summary of it. So we know that Europe's key economic sectors, from healthcare to defense, to the green and digital transitions, and overall the European industrial base, depend on secure supplies and access to critical raw materials. And we know that these are heavily dominated by China. Now, in the past few weeks and months, China has shown an ability and a willingness to disrupt this industrial production in Europe, but also in America and in other places of the world, by imposing export controls on a variety of materials, especially rare earth, gallium, germanium, and others, which are essential to these production lines. Now, we know also that in the United States has moved to try to solve the issues. There was a meeting between President Trump and President Xi Jinping of China in South Korea, where the two had an understanding, and President Xi promised to postpone the introduction of this new export control by at least 1 year, and then to issue general licenses, so-called, for critical material shipments. Again, this is not just for Europe. This was for the US, but then it was applicable to Europe and other countries. Of course, that creates, say, a series of questions, such as, will Beijing keep its words, its promise? Will the crisis represent itself? As we said, it's 1 year. And what should the EU do about it anyway? So these are the issues we're going to delve with Joris in the next 20 minutes or so, and then we will also give you an opportunity to ask questions, you in the audience. So please use the comment section either on LinkedIn or on YouTube to post a message, and we'll do our best to try to answer it. So let me turn now to the real expert, Joris. First of all, let me know if my summary was correct, and I want to also ask you, why did China use this weapon, and why now?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the million-dollar question that the Europeans try to answer throughout this year. Because if you look at the sort of tit-for-tat in the US-China relationship, you see a clear pattern that whenever the United States imposes new semiconductor controls or when they raise tariffs, China adds new critical raw materials. It requires an export license for new critical raw materials. It's almost symmetrical, and it goes back to 2023 when China added gallium and germanium to that list. And if you look at that entire trajectory, what you really see is that only one EU member state, namely the Netherlands, was involved in one of the curbs, one of the measures taken on the US side. And that is the Netherlands with the expansion of controls on ASML, the semiconductor manufacturing equipment manufacturer, their equipment to China, to make sure that not just the leading edge, but also slightly below that, those chip fabrication systems would not move to China anymore. So that's the only time really that a EU member state has been involved in this tit for tat, not in many of the other ones. Another one that's quite obvious is Trump's imposition of the so-called reciprocal tariffs, that led the Chinese to, in the end, put heavy rare earths on the 4th of April on the export controls. So even though we are, by and large, I would say for 95%, not at all a part of this tit for tat, the real question that emerged in Europe is, why are we being crushed? Why is China, according to the figures of the European Chamber of Commerce, only approving 15% of all our rare earth shipments as they are as essential, as you say, for pretty much all of our critical sectors?
Excellent. Hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, sorry. For a moment, there was a freezing for that. So, okay, it is this is a big question indeed, and but we know that it is happening. And
Yeah.
you would say you have put together a number of explanations for why China is doing this. Can you run over them very quickly?
Yeah. So I mean, there's a couple of things. It's part of you have to see it against the background of the long-term goals that China is seeking to achieve. And one of the key goals that underpins many of its other goals is China is trying to build a self-reliant industrial fortress, and by extension, making the rest of the world more dependent on China. And that has all sorts of advantages. That has the advantage of China protecting itself from being cut off from specific critical supplies from abroad. But it also has advantages that if an even greater geopolitical crisis emerges, for instance, a conflict over Taiwan, that China's critical sectors, at least in their estimation, will be well protected. So this fortress is being built, and that has all sorts of consequences. One of the consequences that it has is that China's combination of, on the one hand, very smart and capable industrial policy with, on the other hand, foul play. Think about local content requirements, think about large-scale subsidies for their own sectors, think about forcing our companies in China to work together in joint venture requirements, etc. It results in an over-concentration of manufacturing in China, already at 35%, going to 45% likely by 2040 or 2030. And that sort of manufacturing block is supposed to do two things: give China the means to really put pressure on other countries to keep their markets open, and also to protect China when it pursues its main core interests, for instance, reunification with Taiwan, to make sure that China can disincentivize us from acting against that. And in the critical raw material file, we've seen that in a couple of ways. It's really being used in 8 ways, but I'll save it for 4 really here for this conversation. One that we see is China has used the export control licenses to gather commercially and militarily sensitive intelligence. So anything ranging from product recipes of European companies. Yes, you get your licenses, but you have to, for instance, submit pictures of your drone motors. And on the other hand, lists of your clients, including in the defense realm, helping China to sort of map out our defense industrial base, which of course comes at a time when we also see an uptake in cyber intrusions for many of these companies and our critical infrastructure in general from China. So that's sort of on the intelligence gathering part. On the coercion part, you've seen something else entirely. You've seen Chinese negotiators show up here in Brussels over the summer and say, well, we could maybe greenlight a couple of more license requests, but in exchange, we'd really need you to remove your tariffs on electric vehicles, or we need to remove your local content requirements on medical production, even though our local content requirements are really only a small version of what China has been putting in place really for years now, disincentivizing our companies. And then finally, there's a form of corrosion. Of course, there's production stoppages in Europe, not just here, also in the United States. Because of that, some companies have warned, listen, if we can't get the permanent magnets to produce our car engines here, they said that to President Trump, we might have to offshore the production of the entire engine or the entire car to China, because there we can still get permanent magnets. So you see, it's more than just a sledgehammer to our industries. On top of that, it's really sort of a fish trap. It is making, through these measures, by denying Europeans and Americans the key building blocks that they need to manufacture, it's deepening the dependence on China even more. And then finally, there's an exception on the Chinese side, specifically for military end use, where we've seen that over the summer, at least in what we hear from industry and from policymakers here in Brussels, over the summer, critical raw material exports for military end use in Europe have been categorically denied across the board. And this, of course, I mean, it's almost like pulling a rug from underneath our rearmament. Foreign Minister Wang Yi came to Brussels and he basically said, listen, it is not in our interest that Russia loses the war in Ukraine because of reasons that the Americans might free up resources to strengthen their deterrence in East Asia. So you see a whole range of impacts with an additionally hard impact on the military realm that I think together, combinedly, also really build up Chinese economic deterrence. So whenever the Europeans, for instance, what we do in our political guidelines, whenever we say we want to contribute, for instance, to deterrence around Taiwan, or we want to align with the Americans to better protect our markets against Chinese overproduction or over concentration of critical economic inputs in China, every time in the next couple of months and years, if we'll make a move in that direction, China can just, close the tab a little bit more, can make it hurt a little bit more. And that was really the danger that manifested throughout 2025 so far.
Yeah, thank you, Joris. And I think this really hits at the central question. There are all the things that the Commission has promised to do, namely the competitiveness agenda and the readiness and defense and deterrence agenda, rely on some things that China can basically take away. So that's why it's so central. Thank you for this. And then if that is so central, one would expect that Europe would go directly on it. And the question, though, is that it seems that we are relying right now on the agreement between the US and China, between Trump and Xi. And of course, based on that, if I understand correctly, then the Chinese went to Europe and clarified that those exceptions and so on, and the reprieve applies to Europe as well. And the question for me is this enough? Is it the best that we can do? Is tying ourselves to the US at a time of course, uncertainty on policymaking in Washington sufficient for us?
Yeah. No, I think you said it best. These critical raw materials underpin everything, not just that the Commission is trying to do, but our entire critical sectors and broader economy. Given the scale of materials that we depend on from China, really 19 out of 34 are more than half produced in China, more than 50%. It's really best to imagine this as the skeleton of the global economy. If you pull that out, really nothing works. So that's the depth of the dependency. And then the question you ask is this a cause for celebration? Is what Trump got out of the 30 October deal with Xi Jinping, namely a promise to postpone by 12 months the 9 October expansion of controls, and this sort of general license solution to the earlier controls? Well, first of all, does it apply to Europe as well? And second, what does that mean? Does it mean that we return to a previous phase of unfettered access to these materials, or somewhere in between when this will be rather vague still, and we might see all sorts of disruptions in the future? And if you look at that, I think the answer is twofold. Yes, the Chinese have confirmed to the European side that whatever applies to the US applies to us as well. But what they promised to the US is more partial and more vague than a lot of international reporting acknowledges. So, let's start at the top. So it postpones the 9 October controls. Well, the 9 October controls were only an expansion of the controls that were already in place for rare earths on 4 April and for at least 9 other materials before then. And these controls on 4 April and the ones before then caused the disruptions that you and I just talked about earlier throughout this year. So is there some gain in postponing the 9 October controls? Of course. The 9 October controls, they made them extraterritorial. So what China basically said is, if a permanent magnet produced in Malaysia only has 0.01% of value coming from a Chinese source, either refined or mined material or some permanent magnet making, then China still has the right, once Malaysia ships that to Europe, to demand a Chinese export license for this. So in short, if you're in Malaysia, you produce this magnet and you perhaps use a tool, a refining tool or a permanent magnet tool that originates in China, you now have to phone up the Ministry of Commerce in China asking, where can I supply this to Europe? Same for Japan. So it's a very ambitious scheme to basically regulate trade between all third countries. That was one key aspect of the 9 October controls. Well, that was so ambitious, and I would say the Chinese were probably pretty unprepared to enforce that anyway, that a 12-month postponement, you can ask yourself, how meaningful is it? If those direct controls, namely the controls of exports from China to Europe, remain in place anyway, and if supply and in production at this moment is concentrated in China. And then, of course, Beijing sort of ominously announced, we will use the 12 months to study and refine specific implementation plans. So yes, postponed, but only an expansion of the controls are postponed, not the controls themselves. There were some other things in the 9 October controls. The 9 October controls, they formulated an explicit ban on supplying rare earths or permanent magnets to military end users. But as you and I have just discussed, sort of informally, such a ban kind of was already in place, because categorically over the summer, China denied the licenses for exports of its key materials to European defense suppliers. Well, and then there's a couple of more things that show that the 9 October controls, they are sort of important, but they're not the big deal. The big deal is really the controls before then that caused a lot of havoc already. Well, and if you then look at how those controls have been handled, for those controls, the Chinese have confirmed to the European side, instead of on a case-by-case license, so you have to get a license for each individual shipment, we will now do a general license. So it will be approved for a company, for instance, for the duration of 1 year. But if you ask, does that include all European industries? Well, the figure that we keep hearing from insider sources is about 80%. Well, it matters a lot which industries are in that 80%. If defense and medical and the energy grid and our really vital communications, if our really semiconductors, if our really vital sectors are not included in that 80%, but still have to be in that 20%, then all of the difficulties that we summed up in the beginning of the Chinese licensing regime still applies. The same risks still apply. And on top of that, even if they're in the general controls, you can still make general controls conditional on European companies having to share all sorts of highly sensitive data. So the idea of sort of a spyglass that's hidden in these Chinese export controls stays, of course.
Yeah. So again, I know we can talk about this for a long time, and you have a lot of evidence to bring up to how deep this threat is, and of course how uncertain and limited the solution has been found, which is again mostly relying on China maintaining that agreement with the US and extending to Europe, with all the caveats that you just brought up. But since we don't have too much time, I also want to move and cover the potentially proactive response with the solutions that Europe could to try to implement. It is connected to a question that we received from the chat, which says that we have received that, basically we just need to meet not just the needs of the present, but also of the future. Somebody has also brought up the issue of climate neutrality and clean tech, which I know can lead to potentially issues between the goals of getting these rare earths domestically and meeting those goals. So basically, my question for you is, what is the best thing that Europe can do now, and what can we learn from others?
Yeah, no, great question, because as you say, we are stuck in that sort of US, China, EU triangle. And it's very telling, of course, that the US and China, they have a sort of G2 agreement. They come up with a solution to this that then sort of also applies to us. And that may break down at any moment if there's another spy balloon, if there's rising tensions over Taiwan. Even if the Chinese stick to all their promises that they made to us perfectly, of course, the US-China agreement can still break down. And that can have conclusions or sort of consequences for us too. Now, turning to the question, I think for 30, perhaps 35 years now, Europe has also been very lucky. Because a lot of these industries, they are kind of low economic value added. Yes, they're strategically indispensable. If you don't have your materials, you have a huge problem. But they're energy intensive, emissions intensive, and specific production steps, for instance, rare earth refining, they go hand in hand with very difficult to process waste, in this case, radioactive waste. So the whole globalized era and offshoring these industries that don't really make you a lot of money anyway to China wasn't such a bad deal. When it became a bad deal, of course, is Beijing realizing how essential it is and really pressing their own interests that go against our interests very hard to achieve this. So, I mean, what's sort of, I think, underneath in the comment is we have to be able, not just as Europeans, but also as our partners, to stomach a lot of the difficulties that come with manufacturing again if we want to create greater resilience. And I think we definitely should. So I think that is sort of the overall point. And then, of course, we have all sorts of more specific measures that we recommend the EU would take.
And actually, can we go over some of these measures without going too much into detail? Perhaps one big line there is that comes to mind is the issue of the anti-coercion instrument, which was put together for China. Now, over the year, paradoxically, it has been suggested also to use it against the US in the context of the tariffs. But originally, I think it was designed with China in mind. And many call it a nuclear bomb because it is a big option. And the question is, though, if it comes with some costs and risks, would it be effective? And that's one of the questions I want to pose to you.
Yeah, so I think one of the problems underlying that is when von der Leyen negotiates with either Beijing or Washington, and especially Beijing, it's a very hierarchical state, right? I mean, Xi Jinping sits there and he has all the tools, all the policy tools at his disposal to make a point. So he can cut critical raw material access, he can throw European companies out of China or release their, basically constrain their market access. So he has a broad number of tools through which he can make a threat. And you see the same, I mean, something that you know more of on the US side, of course, that the US can threaten a 30% tariff rate. And then we settle on a 15% tariff rate for European products going into the US, which we can sell at home as, well, it could have been worse. Same on the Chinese side, right? They still use this regime to cut off our access for military end use. They still use this regime to basically spy on our companies. But we can say, well, it could have been a lot worse because at least the Chinese are not squeezing supply as hard anymore as they used to do. I think this is a real problem. I mean, we continuously send the Commission President into basically a gunfight with a knife. And this is especially on the Chinese side, something that's incredibly detrimental to us. So yes, activating the anti-coercion instrument, which will give her more means to engage in these negotiations, is the least we can do to climb closer to parity. Because even if you do that, of course, Xi Jinping has many more tools at his disposal than the European side has.
Yeah, and that creates, of course, a question on escalation and if we're able to do it. Now, another potential set of options is creating partnerships with other countries. And I believe that the United States has been recently, Trump has been on trips to Central Asia and so on. Yeah. It's not just the US, though. Is this a strategy that works and it's feasible for Europe to do something similar?
So the US is doing very important things. If you look at why critical raw material manufacturing and production is so concentrated in China, yes, it has to do with a more permissive environment, but these are also heavily state-sponsored and protected companies. If you look at rare earth specifically, there are 2 rare earth conglomerates yet that do all the production. They can basically set global prices or heavily influence global prices, and they have enormous stockpiles to flood markets and kill any competitors. So the question really is, how do you deal with a monopolist or a near monopolist in many critical raw materials? There's a couple of approaches. What the US has really done is it has gone for the idea of picking winners. So we're just going to throw cash, a couple of $100 million to MP Materials in California to really beef up that rare earth mining capacity there, then do the refining there, then the permanent magnet making process, etc. But then again, you have 19 critical raw materials to cover. And these 19 critical raw materials have very difficult and very granular production steps. So the question is this enough? I think personally, a long-term and suitable solution is you try to recreate international market dynamics, but then without China. So in the EU case, public procurement is up for reform next year. We're building all these wind parks. In every offshore wind turbine, there's about 12,000 kilograms of permanent magnets. Why don't we make explicit in these standards that the permanent magnets, if they come from trusted countries like Japan, or trusted countries like Australia, or trusted countries like Korea, that you get additional points for these standards in order to incentivize not using these subsidized and geopolitically risky magnets from China. And of course, you can do this with sort of a shared tariff regime and sort of price floors within the G7 as well. So what the US is really doing, it's picking winners to some extent, is sort of plugging capability holes with large-scale investment, which is important, which is necessary. The Japanese, to some extent, are doing this as well. But we also need something to protect our markets, because China could also turn around in 2 years, open up the floodgates again, and kill all of its rare earth competitors by just dumping, both on normal markets and black markets, its below market price critical raw materials.
Yeah, you're also saying that there are difficulties here in the classic approach to sort of free market that has always been put, that has been one of the champion of the West, but also of the EU specifically. Now this is going to be hard, especially because these are nascent industries that maybe are economically unfeasible. Now we are going towards the end, so I just want to give you one last word. There are a couple of questions asking whether these materials, specifically gallium, germanium, antimony, will flow more freely for a little bit. My understanding is maybe. So but I want to give you one last word.
Yeah, I mean, it all depends on the mood in Beijing, right? And this is where really the risk lies for Europeans now, because I sense a sort of restraint, but still a sense of optimism moving through Brussels. Like, okay, this problem, we're moving towards solving this problem. And my argument is we're not moving towards solving this problem at all. And we risk losing twice, because our complacency, at least a sense of urgency from earlier this news, put things into movement. The Europeans, we analytically have decided we have our 60 strategic projects in Europe. The question for us still is, how do we make them financially viable in terms of environmental regulations, et cetera, et cetera. But things were moving ahead and people were willing to think more radically. The biggest danger to Europeans on the critical raw material file is now becoming complacent, because China is sort of drip feeding these materials again with all the conditions attached that you and I discussed before. And then sort of, moving back into first gear or even stopping the car and not bringing this online anymore. Whereas a lot of very concrete steps, there is a lot we can do. If you look at gallium, it's a minor metal. It's something that Europe used to produce until 2015. The capabilities are here. But we just need to invest a minor sum of money to show that this can work and that we can bring online gallium. If you look at the opportunities for collaboration with the Japanese have many more advanced projects because they've already been on this since 10 years ago. You can become a co-investor under particular conditions that you can negotiate. And then you can say, well, whatever these Japanese sort of state investment vehicle produces, we can use that for European companies as well. And of course, a topic that you and I have extensively worked on, Giuseppe, is that there's a lot of defense funding coming up in the upcoming future. We need all these critical raw materials as well for weapon systems. If the critical raw materials are not there, the weapon systems are just becoming more expensive, which means we'll move from 2% of NATO spending to 5% of NATO spending without actually getting new weapon systems. So you can also just make critical raw material production both eligible under the 1.5% and maybe even the 3.5%. So there's a lot of things that can be done, but we need to move beyond just the analytical plans, just sketching out these are strategic projects that we could do. And the deep thought needs to go into how do you make these projects both financially, environmentally, politically, economically viable in the upcoming future.
Yeah, fantastic, Joris. And I think you're touching on so many other topics because you just mentioned it is connected to defense spending and the rearmament of Europe. It is connected to partnerships and how you create value added without China. It is connected to the other transitions that are meant to be in place. It is connected to, of course, this is all part of the risking strategy. It's very real. And it's all connected to the work that we are doing at the UISS. So just to plug in the fact that for the audience to stay in touch and be connected to the things that we're writing. I know that Joris soon will come up with a series with a longer paper on this topic, and he's also leading our Chip Diplo project. So stay in touch for that as well. And more generally, we come to a conclusion. So I thank everyone for participating. Thank you, Joris, for sharing your expertise on this timely topic. We will do more on this and on other topics, so stay in tune for new activities and new episodes of Europe Response from the UI Assessed. Thank you very much and have a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you so much, Giuseppe.
Bye.